California's wildfires are a tragedy we've come to expect, but this fire was different. What started as a flicker in the heart of an ancient forest became an unstoppable inferno, consuming everything in its path. But the flames weren't the scariest part. It was the truth hiding behind them. It began on a warm summer evening, with a sudden plume of smoke rising from the Angeles National Forest. A hiker named Callum Davis was the first to notice it, a column of gray against the orange sky. He called it in, his voice calm but concerned as he described what he saw. But the dispatcher heard something else in his voice, a note of unease that went beyond the sight of the smoke. The fire response was swift. Crews were dispatched, helicopters loaded with water took to the air, and the ground teams prepared for what they believed would be a routine operation. But when they reached the site of the fire's origin, they found something strange. The ground was scorched in a perfect circle, as though the fire had started in an instant. There was no evidence of a campfire or lightning strike, nothing to explain how it began. And then there were the symbols. Carved into the ground around the burn site were markings no one could identify. They formed an intricate pattern, their lines precise despite the ash and debris. One firefighter described them as unsettling, though he couldn't explain why. Photos were taken, but they were never made public. The symbols were dismissed as vandalism, and the focus shifted to containing the fire. But the fire didn't behave the way they expected. It moved faster than the wind should have allowed, spreading uphill against natural barriers. It jumped rivers and roads, defying containment lines. And then the reports began. Whispers carried on the smoke, faint cries for help that seemed to come from nowhere. One firefighter, a rookie named Josh Kramer, described hearing his own name. He was certain it came from the flames, but when he turned to look, there was no one there. His team wrote it off as stress, but Josh couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. The fire spread across 10,000 acres in less than 24 hours, forcing entire towns to evacuate. Helicopters circled above, their cameras capturing the surreal sight of flames moving in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. The smoke rose high into the atmosphere, turning the sun into a dull, red orb. The air was thick with ash, and the once clear skies of Southern California became a canvas of gray and orange. Among those watching the news coverage was Evelyn Hart, an investigative journalist who had spent years uncovering government cover-ups and corporate scandals. Evelyn wasn't the type to chase ghost stories, but something about this fire caught her attention. The photos of the burn site, the missing explanations, the whispers in the smoke. It all felt wrong. Evelyn made a few calls, pulling strings to get access to the incident reports. What she found was troubling. Redacted statements from firefighters, missing radio logs, and conflicting timelines. It was as though someone didn't want the full story to come out. She decided to head to the fire's edge, where the evacuation orders were in effect but the danger had yet to reach. Armed with her camera, a notepad, and her unshakable determination, Evelyn entered a world of chaos. Families loaded their belongings into cars, their faces etched with fear. Firefighters worked tirelessly to hold the line, their eyes reflecting both exhaustion and dread. Evelyn spoke to anyone who would talk to her. Residents, first responders, even a local historian who claimed the fire wasn't an accident. He spoke of the forest as though it were alive, describing it as a place with a long history of tragedy and mystery. This land has been angry for a long time, he said. The settlers who came here in the 1800s, they took what they wanted and left nothing behind. The tribes who lived here before them tried to warn them, but they didn't listen. Now the land's taking it back. Evelyn was skeptical but intrigued. She pressed him for details, and he told her about a settlement called Black Hollow, a town that had been destroyed by fire over a century ago. The fire was said to have started in the same area as the current blaze, and the survivors claimed it wasn't natural. They spoke of shadows moving in the flames, of voices calling out to them, and of a sense of overwhelming dread that drove them to flee. The historian handed Evelyn an old map, its edges worn and its ink faded. He pointed to a location deep in the forest, near the origin point of the fire. "If you want answers," he said, "this is where you'll find them. But be careful. Some truths aren't meant to be uncovered." Evelyn thanked him and set out for the forest, her curiosity outweighing her fear. She didn't know what she would find, but she was determined to follow the trail of lies that surrounded the fire. As she approached the edge of the burn zone, the air grew heavier, the smell of smoke thick in her nostrils. The forest was silent except for the crackle of distant flames. And then she heard it, the faint sound of whispers carried on the wind. She stopped in her tracks, her heart pounding. The whispers grew louder, forming words she couldn't quite make out. She turned, expecting to see someone behind her, but there was no one there. Evelyn took a deep breath and pressed on, her camera recording everything. She didn't know what she was walking into, but she knew she couldn't turn back. The fire wasn't just a disaster, it was a message, and she was determined to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. Evelyn Hart ventured deeper into the burned forest, her boots crunching over ash and debris. The smell of charred wood and scorched earth filled the air, but it wasn't just the destruction that unsettled her. It was the stillness. The forest, once alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves, was now silent, as though holding its breath. The map the historian had given her was old and imprecise, but it was her only guide. It marked a location deep in the forest, near the origin point of the fire. As she walked, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The shadows cast by the distant flames seemed to move, shifting and flickering in ways that defied explanation. Her camera hung around her neck, its lens capturing the eerie landscape. She stopped occasionally to take photos of the burn patterns, which seemed almost unnatural. The fire had left precise lines of destruction, as though it had been guided by an invisible hand. As she approached the location marked on the map, Evelyn noticed something strange. The ground beneath her feet was warm, radiating heat that seemed to grow stronger with each step. And then she saw it. A circle of stones, blackened but intact, with strange symbols carved into their surfaces. Evelyn knelt beside the stones, her heart pounding. The symbols were intricate, their lines sharp and deliberate. She pulled out her notebook, sketching the markings and taking detailed notes. The air around her felt heavy, as though the forest itself was watching her every move. Suddenly, a sound broke the silence, a faint whisper carried on the wind. Evelyn froze, her pulse racing. She looked around, but there was no one there. The whisper grew louder, forming words she couldn't understand. It was coming from the direction of the stones. Evelyn reached for her camera, her hands trembling. She began recording, the lens focused on the stones as the whispers grew louder. The symbols seemed to glow faintly in the light of the flames, their lines pulsing with an energy that defied logic. And then she heard a voice. "You shouldn't be here." Evelyn spun around, her flashlight sweeping through the darkness. The voice had been clear, unmistakable, but there was no one there. She called out, her voice shaky. "Who's there?" The forest was silent. Evelyn's breathing was heavy as she turned back to the stones. She reached out to touch one, her fingers brushing against its rough surface. The moment she made contact, a searing pain shot through her hand, and she pulled back with a gasp. Her vision blurred, and for a moment, she saw something, images flashing through her mind like fragments of a dream. She saw the settlers of Black Hollow, their faces etched with fear as flames consumed their homes. She saw the indigenous tribes, their rituals desperate and mournful, their chants rising above the roar of the fire. And she saw the land itself, scarred and broken, its spirit crying out for justice. Evelyn stumbled back, her breath ragged. The whispers had stopped, and the forest was silent once more. She looked at the stones, their symbols now faint and lifeless. What was that? She whispered to herself. She packed her notebook and camera, her hands still shaking. Whatever she had seen, it wasn't just her imagination. The fire wasn't just a disaster. It was the manifestation of something much older, much angrier. Evelyn's next stop was the local library, where she combed through records of Black Hollow and the surrounding area. She found accounts of the fire that had destroyed the settlement, stories of shadows in the flames, and voices that called out to the survivors. One account, written by a man who had fled the fire, described a strange ritual performed by the settlers in an attempt to protect their town. According to the account, the ritual involved an artifact, a stone tablet inscribed with symbols similar to those Evelyn had seen in the forest. The ritual had failed, and the fire had consumed the settlement, leaving nothing behind but ash. Evelyn knew she had to find the artifact. If it still existed, it might hold the key to understanding the fire and the forces behind it. She reached out to Marcus Taylor, a local park ranger who had been among the first to report the fire. Marcus had seen the destruction up close and had his own questions about what had happened. Evelyn convinced him to help her, and together they began searching for clues about the artifact's location. Their investigation led them to a remote section of the forest that had been largely untouched by the fire. As they ventured deeper, the air grew colder, and the whispers returned. "Do you hear that?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn nodded, her heart pounding. The whispers were faint but distinct, overlapping voices that seemed to come from every direction. They reached a clearing where the ground was marked with more symbols, arranged in a pattern that mirrored the carvings on the stones. In the center of the clearing was a charred wooden box, partially buried in the ash. Evelyn knelt beside the box, her hands trembling as she opened it. Inside, she found the artifact, a stone tablet inscribed with the same symbols she had seen in the forest. The tablet was warm to the touch, its surface radiating a faint, otherworldly glow. As Evelyn examined the tablet, the whispers grew louder, their voices filled with anger and sorrow. She felt a sudden surge of energy, as though the forest itself was alive, watching her, judging her. "We need to leave," Marcus said, his voice trembling. Evelyn nodded, but as she stood, she felt a sharp pain in her chest. She gasped, clutching the tablet as images flooded her mind once again. She saw the settlers, the tribes, the fire, everything. And then she heard a voice, clear and unmistakable. "The truth will cost you." Evelyn and Marcus fled the clearing, the whispers following them. As they emerged from the forest, Evelyn knew that they had uncovered something powerful, something that had been buried for centuries. But the truth, she realized, was only the beginning. The drive back to town was silent except for the faint hum of the car engine. Evelyn clutched the artifact in her lap, her fingers tracing the engraved symbols on its surface. Marcus drove with both hands on the wheel, his knuckles white, his eyes fixed on the road. Neither of them spoke about what they had seen, but the weight of it hung heavy in the air. When they reached Evelyn's motel, they hurried inside, locking the door behind them. Evelyn placed the artifact on the small desk, its faint glow casting flickering shadows on the walls. Marcus pulled a chair up to the table, his expression grim. "What now?" he asked. Evelyn didn't answer immediately. She opened her notebook, flipping through the pages of sketches and notes she had taken over the past few days. The symbols on the artifact matched the markings she had seen at the fire's origin point and the clearing in the forest. They told a story, one of betrayal, vengeance, and a curse tied to the land. "This artifact," Evelyn began, her voice steady but low, "it's part of a ritual. The settlers used it to try and protect their town, but they didn't understand what they were dealing with. They broke something that was never meant to be disturbed." Marcus frowned. "And now the fire's a punishment?" Evelyn nodded. "Not just a punishment, a warning. The fire isn't just burning the land. It's trying to tell us something." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his face pale. So what do we do? Take it back to the forest? Destroy it? Evelyn hesitated. Destroying the artifact might end the fire, but it could also unleash something far worse. She needed more information before making a decision. That night, Evelyn stayed up late, poring over old maps and historical records. The settlers of Black Hollow had been desperate to survive in an unforgiving land. They had cut down ancient trees, diverted streams, and built their homes on sacred ground. When the indigenous tribes protested, they were met with violence. The tribes had performed a ritual to protect the land, invoking the spirits tied to the forest. But the settlers, fearing the power of the ritual, had disrupted it. The artifact Evelyn had found was meant to seal the ritual, to bind the spirits and maintain balance. Instead, it had been buried, its power left to fester. As Evelyn pieced the story together, the whispers returned. They were faint at first, barely audible over the hum of the motel's air conditioner. But as the night wore on, they grew louder, overlapping voices filled with anger and sorrow. Evelyn turned off the light, her heart pounding. The room was dark except for the glow of the artifact. She could feel the whispers pressing against her mind, pulling her toward the desk. She approached cautiously, her breath shallow. The artifact's glow pulsed in time with the whispers, its light growing brighter with each step she took. And then, she saw it. A shadowy figure reflected in the motel window. It stood motionless, its form indistinct but undeniably human. Evelyn spun around, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The room was empty, the whispers stopped, and the artifact's glow faded. Evelyn stood in silence, her body trembling. She didn't know what she had seen, but she knew it wasn't just her imagination. The next morning, Evelyn and Marcus met with a local historian who had spent years studying the region's folklore. The historian, a woman named Dr. Miriam Vaughn, confirmed Evelyn's findings. The fire isn't just a natural phenomenon, Dr. Vaughn explained. It's tied to the land's history. The settlers desecrated sacred sites, and the spirits of the land retaliated. The artifact you found, it's a conduit. It's amplifying the fire's power. So how do we stop it? Marcus asked. Dr. Vaughn hesitated. You might not be able to, she said, but if there's a chance, it lies in completing the ritual. You'll need to return the artifact to its rightful place and perform the ceremony the tribes intended. Evelyn frowned. And if we fail? Dr. Vaughn's expression darkened. Then the fire will consume everything. Armed with this knowledge, Evelyn and Marcus prepared to return to the forest. They gathered supplies and studied the details of the ritual, determined to get it right. But as they prepared to leave, the whispers returned, louder than ever. Evelyn froze, her heart racing. The whispers seemed to come from all around her, filling the room with their chaotic symphony. And then, one voice rose above the others. You cannot stop it. The air grew cold, and the lights flickered. Marcus grabbed Evelyn's arm, pulling her toward the door. We need to go, he said urgently. They drove to the edge of the forest, the artifact glowing faintly in the passenger seat. The fire had been contained, but the burned landscape stretched as far as the eye could see. Evelyn felt a knot of fear in her stomach as they stepped out of the car, the whispers once again following them. As they ventured deeper into the forest, the air grew heavier, and the ground beneath their feet seemed to vibrate. The artifact's glow pulsed in time with the hum that filled the air. This is it, Evelyn said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. They reached the clearing where they had found the artifact. The ground was still marked with symbols, their lines faint but visible. Evelyn placed the artifact in the center of the clearing, its glow casting long shadows on the trees. She began to recite the words of the ritual, her voice trembling. The air around them seemed to thicken, and the whispers grew louder, their voices filled with anger and sorrow. As Evelyn completed the first part of the ritual, the ground began to shake, and the symbols on the artifact flared brightly. The shadowy figures returned, their forms circling the clearing. Marcus stepped back, his flashlight flickering. "Evelyn, hurry!" he shouted. Evelyn continued the ritual, her voice growing stronger as the symbols on the ground glowed brighter. The shadowy figures closed in, their movements deliberate and menacing. And then, with a final word, Evelyn completed the ritual. The artifact's glow exploded in a burst of light, and the shadowy figures dissolved into the air. The whispers stopped, and the forest fell silent. Evelyn and Marcus stood in stunned silence, their breaths ragged. The artifact was gone, reduced to ash. The fire was extinguished, its presence erased from the air. But as they made their way out of the forest, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't truly stopped the fire. The truth they had uncovered was only the beginning. The drive away from the forest was suffused with a tense silence. Evelyn sat in the passenger seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed out the window as the landscape passed by. Marcus, focused on the road, occasionally glanced at her, his expression filled with unspoken questions. The artifact was gone, reduced to ash in the ritual's final moments. The fire seemed to be extinguished, but Evelyn felt no relief. The truth they had uncovered, the history, the spirits, the ritual, was far more unsettling than the flames themselves. Back in town, Evelyn and Marcus decided to document everything they had found. They compiled their notes, photos, and recordings, preparing to share their story with anyone who would listen. Evelyn reached out to contacts in the media, but the responses were lukewarm. Most dismissed her claims as conspiracy theories or sensationalism, unwilling to believe that a wildfire could be anything more than a natural disaster. But Evelyn's persistence paid off when a small, independent news outlet agreed to meet with her. The editor, a woman named Linda Reyes, listened intently as Evelyn laid out the story. The history of Black Hollow, the desecration of sacred land, the artifact, and the ritual. "If this is true," Linda said, her voice measured, "it changes everything we know about these fires." Evelyn nodded. "It's not just about this fire," she said. "It's about the lies that have been told to cover up what's really happening. The land isn't just burning. It's fighting back." Linda agreed to publish an article, but as Evelyn and Marcus began to share their evidence, they encountered resistance. Files disappeared from their computers. Emails went unanswered. Phone calls were abruptly disconnected. Evelyn's frustration turned to suspicion when Marcus received an anonymous message on his phone. "Stop digging. This is bigger than you know." The message was followed by a second text containing a photo of Evelyn and Marcus standing in the forest, taken from an angle neither of them recognized. "They're watching us," Marcus said, his voice tight with fear. Evelyn stared at the photo, her mind racing. Someone wanted to keep the truth buried, and they were willing to go to great lengths to silence her. Determined to push forward, Evelyn delved deeper into the history of Black Hollow and its connection to the fire. She uncovered records of land ownership dating back to the 1800s, revealing a pattern of suspicious transactions. The land had been bought and sold by a series of shadowy corporations, each tied to a powerful family in Los Angeles. Evelyn's investigation led her to the family's estate, a sprawling mansion on the outskirts of the city. She decided to confront them directly, dragging Marcus along despite his protests. The estate was heavily guarded, its gates adorned with ornate ironwork depicting flames and symbols that sent a chill down Evelyn's spine. They were the same symbols she had seen in the forest. A security guard stopped them at the gate, his expression unreadable. Evelyn introduced herself and demanded to speak with the family. The guard made a call, and after a tense few minutes, the gates opened. Evelyn and Marcus were escorted into the mansion's grand foyer, its walls lined with portraits of stern-faced men and women. The air was heavy with the scent of old wood and something faintly metallic. They were led into a dimly lit study, where a man in his 60s sat behind a massive desk. His name was Charles Langford, the current head of the family that had owned the land for generations. You've been asking questions, Langford said, his voice calm but cold. Dangerous questions. Evelyn didn't flinch. I want to know the truth, she said. Why have you been covering up what's happening in the forest? Langford leaned back in his chair, studying her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. The truth, he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. The truth is that some things are better left alone. You knew about the artifact, Evelyn pressed. You knew about the curse, the fire. Why didn't you stop it? Langford's smile faded. Do you think we haven't tried? He said. Do you think we haven't sacrificed enough? Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. Sacrificed? She asked. Langford gestured to the bookshelves lining the walls, their spines marked with symbols similar to those on the artifact. The fire isn't just a punishment, he said. It's a cycle, one that has existed long before any of us were born. We've done everything we can to contain it, to keep it from spreading. But the land, it has its own will. And the lies? Evelyn asked, her voice trembling. The cover-ups? Langford's gaze hardened. Would you rather the world know the truth? He said. That the land itself is angry? That the fire is alive? Panic would destroy more than the flames ever could. Evelyn stood, her hands clenched into fists. People deserve to know, she said. Langford shook his head. People deserve safety, he said. And sometimes safety means silence. As Evelyn and Marcus left the estate, their minds raced with the implications of what they had heard. The fire was more than just a natural disaster. It was a battle between humanity and the land, a struggle for control that had been raging for centuries. But Evelyn wasn't ready to give up. She knew the truth needed to be told, even if it came at a cost. That night, as she sat at her desk, typing up her findings, the whispers returned. They were louder now, more insistent, their voices filled with anger and sorrow. And then, she heard it again, the same voice that had spoken to her in the forest. The truth will cost you. Evelyn froze, her heart pounding. She turned to the window, her breath catching in her throat. A faint glow lit up the horizon, and for a moment, she thought she saw shadows moving against the light. The fire wasn't gone. It was waiting. Evelyn Hart knew the truth now. The fire wasn't just an act of nature, nor was it merely the result of human carelessness. It was alive, a force tied to the land's history, awakened by greed, destruction, and centuries of lies. The artifact was gone, the ritual incomplete, and the fire was still out there, waiting for its moment to strike again. But Evelyn wasn't ready to give up. She and Marcus had uncovered enough to know that the fire could be confronted, but it would require courage, sacrifice, and an understanding of the land's deepest secrets. We have to go back, Evelyn said as she packed her bag. Marcus stared at her, incredulous. Go back? Evelyn, we barely made it out the last time. And now you want to face that thing again. We don't have a choice, Evelyn said, her voice steady. If we don't finish this, the fire will return. And next time, it won't stop. Marcus sighed, running a hand through his hair. You're asking me to walk into a death trap. Evelyn met his gaze, her expression resolute. I'm asking you to help me save lives. Reluctantly, Marcus agreed. They spent the next day preparing, gathering supplies, and studying the details of the ritual. Dr. Vaughn provided what little guidance she could, warning them of the risks involved. The land isn't just angry, it's wounded, Dr. Vaughn said. The fire is its way of protecting itself. If you're going to confront it, you need to understand that it's not just the fire you're fighting. It's the land itself. The following evening, Evelyn and Marcus returned to the forest, their nerves on edge as they approached the burned clearing. The air was thick with smoke, and the faint hum they had heard before had returned, vibrating through the ground and into their bones. They reached the clearing just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the forest in a dim, orange glow. The ground was still marked with symbols, their lines faint but visible in the fading light. Evelyn knelt beside them, her hands trembling as she unpacked her supplies. "Are you sure about this?" Marcus asked, his voice tight with fear. Evelyn nodded. "If we don't finish the ritual, the fire will never stop." As Evelyn began to arrange the items they had brought, the air around them grew colder. The hum intensified, and the symbols on the ground began to glow faintly. The whispers returned, louder than ever, their voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony. "Stay close," Evelyn said, her voice barely audible over the noise. She began to recite the words of the ritual, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. The symbols on the ground flared brighter with each word, their light casting eerie shadows on the surrounding trees. As she spoke, the whispers grew louder, their tone shifting from anger to sorrow. The ground beneath them trembled, and the air filled with the scent of burning wood. And then the shadows appeared. They emerged from the darkness, their forms indistinct but undeniably human. They moved with a deliberate, menacing grace, circling the clearing as Evelyn continued the ritual. "Evelyn," Marcus said, his voice trembling. "They're getting closer. I see them," Evelyn replied, her focus unwavering. The shadows stopped at the edge of the clearing, their forms flickering like smoke in the firelight. One stepped forward, its face obscured but its presence overwhelming. "You cannot stop it," the shadow said, its voice echoing through the clearing. Evelyn faltered, the words of the ritual caught in her throat. She looked up at the shadow, her heart pounding. "We're not here to stop it," she said. "We're here to make it right." The shadow tilted its head, as though considering her words. The whispers softened, and the hum grew quieter. Evelyn took a deep breath and continued the ritual, her voice stronger now. The symbols on the ground glowed brighter, their light pulsating in time with her words. The shadow stepped closer, its presence almost tangible. Evelyn held her ground, her gaze locked on the figure. "You have taken so much," the shadow said, its voice filled with sorrow. "What will you give in return?" Evelyn hesitated, the weight of the question pressing down on her. She thought of the lives lost to the fire, the land scarred by greed and destruction. She knew what the shadow was asking. "Take me," she said, her voice steady. Marcus froze. "Evelyn, no." "It's the only way," Evelyn said, cutting him off. "The ritual needs a sacrifice. The land needs balance." The shadow extended a hand, its form shifting like smoke. Evelyn stepped forward, her heart pounding but her resolve unshaken. As she reached out to touch the shadow, a burst of light filled the clearing. The symbols on the ground flared brighter than ever, their light consuming everything. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, and the ground beneath them shook violently. Marcus shielded his eyes, shouting Evelyn's name. When the light finally faded, the clearing was silent. The shadows were gone, the symbols dim and lifeless, and Evelyn was nowhere to be seen. Marcus fell to his knees, his breath ragged. The artifact was gone, the fire extinguished. The forest was still and quiet, its scars illuminated by the faint light of the moon. As Marcus made his way out of the forest, the whispers returned, faint but distinct. He paused, looking back at the clearing one last time, and in the distance he thought he saw her, a faint silhouette standing among the trees, watching him. The fire was gone, but the truth Evelyn had uncovered would haunt him forever. The land was at peace, but the cost had been great. And as Marcus walked away, the faint sound of whispers followed him, carried on the wind.